Welcome, everybody. I'm Peter Maravellis. Welcome to City Lights, those of you online as well. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ohlone people. Just want to take a moment to acknowledge those who have come before us as stewards of the land. So we are delighted to have Angela Garcia with us here tonight, celebrating this amazing new tome, The Way That Leads Among the Lost, Life, Death, and Hope in Mexico City's Anexos. It is published by our friends at Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, and is based on over a decade of research. Angela Garcia has generated a powerful, very moving work of narrative nonfiction that brings to light the little-known world of the Anexos of Mexico City. Now, these are informal addiction treatment centers where mothers send their kids to escape the violence of the drug war. So this is the first book ever on this subject, and Ms. Garcia's scholarship is, of course, impeccable. She is an anthropologist and writer. Her first book, The Pastoral Clinic, received the Victor Turner Prize for Ethnographic Writing and the Penn Center USA Award for Exceptional First Book. Originally from New Mexico, she now makes her home in San Francisco. She's going to be joined tonight by none other than Richard Walker. He is no stranger to City Lights. We've had the pleasure of hosting him in the past. He is actually taught from 1975 to 2012 in the University of California at Berkeley in the geography department. He's written on a diverse range of topics in economic, urban, and environmental geography with numerous published articles. To his credit, he's written extensively on California. His books include The Conquest of Bread, The Country and the City, The Atlas of California, amongst others. Professor Walker is currently director of the Living New Deal Project. Really such a pleasure to have you both with us here tonight. We're going to be hosting a signing at the very end, also a Q&A. For those of you online, you may post your questions in the chat. Welcome to you both.
Thank you so much. I want to say that this is really a dream come true for me, because when I moved to San Francisco when I was 17, this is the second place I visited. First Roosevelt Tamale Parlor, and then this bookstore. So I'm very happy to be here. I want to begin with I'm going to do a couple of very short selections from a few of the different chapters that I think give a sense of the book as a whole. And I'll begin with the prologue, which in some sense sets the stage for one of the key questions, which is how does a mother care for a child in the setting of extreme insecurity? So it begins like this. At 6 o'clock in the morning on July 19, 2014, Hortensia opened the door of the apartment she shared with her teenage son, Daniel. They lived on the second floor of a century-old tenement in Mexico City's historic center. The three-story building was composed of small two-room units that faced an open-aired courtyard on the ground floor. Hortensia could hear her neighbors in the courtyard preparing food and setting up shop for another day's work. Two men stood at the threshold of her door. She'd never seen them before and didn't know their names, but she knew they were the servers that she'd called to deliver Daniel to an anexo, an annex, the name for a clandestine, low-cost drug recovery center. Anexos are controversial for their illegality and use of violence, but for many Mexican mothers, they are the only way to ensure a child's safety from the danger that surrounds the narco war. The anexo Hortensia called upon had been recommended by a neighbor, a mother with a son very much like her own, aimless, worryingly depressed, using drugs and selling them too. At her wit's end and afraid for Danielle's life, Hortensia took the number her neighbor gave her, and the pickup was quickly arranged. The men pushed past Hortensia and headed straight for Danielle, who was passed out on a recliner in front of a television. Hortensia closed the door and rushed to her son's side, unsure if she should help the men wrestle Danielle awake or protect him from them. They told me to get out of the way, she recalled as we sat together in her cramped but orderly home. It was just a few weeks after the house call. The story Hortensia told me would take years for me to fully understand. I asked very few questions and listened quietly while she spoke. The servers worked in brusque, well-practiced movements. One yanked Danielle out of the chair and tossed him onto the floor. The other kicked him. As she recalled that morning, Hortensia took deep breaths and swept aside the dark bangs that kept falling in front of her eyes, like curtains repeatedly opening and closing on a difficult scene. She described one of the men hovering inches from Daniel's face, spewing insults at him. I could hear the terrible, terrible things he said. The other one, he kicked and kicked my son. Hortensia pleaded with the men to stop hurting Daniel, but they kept on. I told them I made a mistake. I didn't ask for this. I told them to let go of Daniel, and I'd still pay the fee. Unable to take it anymore, Hortensia leaped off the sofa and grabbed the arms of one of the men. He turned to her and told her to back off. You want this to work, senora? You want him to live? That's what he said. Hortensia realized then that she had subjected Daniel and herself to a violence she could not undo. Hortensia sat back down and forced herself to watch what happened next, in case I needed to make a report, she said. But she didn't know whom she would submit a report to. She knew of no trusted authorities or organizations that might help. Not the police. Everyone knew they were corrupt and dangerous. In fact, the servers who were degrading and beating Danielle were the only ones she knew willing to help. One of the servers pulled Danielle to his feet and secured him in a headlock. The other zip-tied Danielle's hands behind his back, slipped a hood over his head, and dragged him out the door. It was boom, 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 and then they were gone. Did the neighbors in the courtyard see what was happening? I asked. Of course. Did they respond in any way? She shook her head. What could they do? They've seen this before. They knew what was happening. We both fell quiet. A few moments passed before I asked Hortensia what she did after losing sight of her son. I sat right here. I cried for a while, and then I went to work. So that is how the book begins. And I went originally to Mexico City in 2011 to study a massive development plan called Health City. I'm a medical anthropologist, so I'm interested in health and addiction in particular. And I was interested in how this big mega project was going to be developed in Mexico City's volcanic landscape. And so the first chapter describes how I moved my study from really this interested in architecture and health and addiction in this urban landscape, and then found myself drawn increasingly to this world of Anexos, which I came to know about through the lessons of a taxi driver, which is actually how a lot of anthropologists end up coming to their subjects of study. Happens through the wise discussions that we have with taxi drivers. And so through Manuel, who I mentioned a couple of times in this reading, I came to learn of my first Anexo, and this little piece describes my entry into it. A young man unlocked a gate and escorted us inside. The gate opened onto a neat courtyard framed by 2 stories of apartments. Kids kicked a ball around, women cooked in a shared outdoor kitchen, an old man read a newspaper. It was a relaxed atmosphere, and the aromas of food clung to the sticky summer air. Serenity, the name of the Anexo, was in a corner unit on the 2nd floor. It didn't have just one door, it had 3, an iron grill, a metal door, and then a wood one. Unlocking them was a long and noisy process. Our escort talked to Manuel as he fumbled with a ring of keys. I could hear sounds from inside. Somebody was screaming, somebody was crying. A sour smell of bleach, cigarettes, and unbathed bodies hit me as soon as I entered Serenity. An oscillating fan pushed the odor from one side of the room to the other, over the heads of people, so many people, all sitting cross-legged on the floor. They were los anexados, the annexed. I glanced around the room, cramped and dim. In one corner stood a wooden lectern, and the other, a disheveled young man faced a wall. He turned his head to look at me. I could see that he was crying. The room was about 20 by 15 feet, with a water-stained ceiling and a cracked tile floor. The cement walls were painted an ugly green, and bolts of white chalk filled their many cracks. Curls of yellowing paint hung from the ceiling. A few months earlier, a major earthquake hit Oaxaca and also shook Mexico City. It was impossible to look at the ceiling and not think of it as falling. Nailed to the walls were announcements and handwritten slogans, all ending with an exclamation mark. 5 a.m., get up, do not touch, live and let live. There were large sepia-toned portraits of Bill W. and Dr. Bob, co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, and an unadorned wooden cross. There were no beds or any other furniture that one might expect to find in a place where so many people lived, just tightly rolled blankets and chairs stacked neatly against a wall. Some of the anexados hung their head. Others looked at me with interest or scorn. They were mostly teenagers, many of them male. I spotted two young women sitting beside each other. I offered them a faint smile. Only one of them returned it. The air in the room felt thick and seemed to get caught in my throat. I started coughing. It started off slow and shallow, then developed into desperate gasping. Suddenly, I was holding a cup of water I was afraid to drink, but I drank from the cup, imagining it as a communion chalice. When my cough finally settled, Manuel and I were led to the back of the room, weaving between people's bodies as we made our way. I fixed my eyes on the floor, careful to not step on the anexados' hands or trip on their legs. I felt ashamed of my immobility and wanted to leave. But before I could flee, our guide tapped 3 times on a closed door before opening it and gesturing us to enter. So the rest of the chapter really begins with my understanding and description of Anexos, which are these unregulated treatment centers for people with addiction and mental illness that are run by and for the urban poor. The next chapter, which is called The Little Room, begins to describe my own personal relationship to this material. My story, my personal story of abandonment intersects in surprising ways with the ethnographic material that I write about. And so this chapter begins like this. When I was a child, I spent hours in little rooms. In New Mexico, it was a shack behind my grandmother's house where thin slices of beef dried on a clothesline, hanging like sleeping bats. In Illinois, I huddled in the dark triangular nook underneath the stairs and listened to the thud of my older brother's footsteps. When we lived in Maine, I spent afternoons in the attic space on the top of the stairway, its ceiling so low I could touch the splintery wood with my hand. And when I was 16, back in New Mexico, it was a cubby in the public library where I spent homeless days worried about homeless nights. Some psychologists call tight spaces like these secret hideaways where kids assert their independence. For me, they were a test of my mother's love. I wanted her to come for me. I'd wait for the door to suddenly open and daylight to rush in. Sometimes I waited all night, only to crawl out in the morning, my hair laced with cobwebs. It was in these tiny rooms that I learned how to see in the dark. Anexos captivated me immediately. It was like a reflex, small, dim rooms filled with troubled kids. 16-year-old Cesar with a mismatched eyes, the gray one wandering outward. 18-year-old Franklin, who tried to distract his stutter with forearms covered in whorls of black tattoos. Luna la Pensativa, the pensive emo girl who spent her free time writing out the lyrics to her favorite songs. Meche la Machita, the little butch who was in love with Luna and threatened to kill anyone who hurt her. And Ceci, whose black hair and green eyes reminded me of Kate's. It was Kate who introduced me to the cathedral. The cathedral is an old freight shop where trains used to be in Albuquerque, but it was abandoned and it became a place where homeless kids used to hang out. We were both 16 at the time. She was homeless and I lived in the Mother Road hostel, not far in circumstance from her and the kids who made a life for themselves in that grim space with the grand name. The cathedral was a place of last resort for young people who'd already succumbed to poverty, drugs, and violence. But it was also a place of friendship and mutual support, with ratty kids sharing stories and substances to relieve the ache of their abandonment. Truthfully, the place terrified me. I worried that with one misstep, I might find myself among its residents, folded into a blanket and sleeping on a concrete floor. I wanted to imagine myself far from that crowd, even though I wasn't. The main difference between Anexos and the cathedral wasn't just one of size. It was that with Anexos, there was always somebody on the outside keeping you in. Hard as life was, there was an understanding that someone cared enough to lock you up. The only people looking out for the kids at the cathedral were the kids who lived there, and they weren't locked up. They were free to roam at their own peril. They had the sense to huddle together, sometimes building a fire in the middle of the colossal building at night, telling stories that ricocheted off the walls while they got high. In Anexos, not everyone was a teenager. Lupe had 3 kids and annexed her son Miguel at Serenity when he was just 12 years old. Then, when Miguel was in his early 20s, he committed his mother to Anexo to curb her drinking. Efren was in his late 40s or early 50s. He couldn't remember. He only knew that he was older than everyone else and deserved their respect. Delia was a thin, wiry woman with a gray braid that ran down her back. People told me not to bother talking to her because she'd lost touch with reality. One afternoon, she walked up to me, shaking her finger back and forth in my face as if clearing the air. I have not lost touch with reality, she said in a quivering voice. I cannot escape it. So the little room goes on to tell the story of Delia and the anexo that she lived in for much of her life, which is also in the tenement apartment building where she was born and raised. And many anexos, I should say, are located within these kind of um, dwellings where multiple families live, and there will be a room dedicated to confining usually a child and sometimes a spouse who either has addiction problems or mental illness. And so these spaces of confinement, of treatment, are very much housed within these larger familial communities. And so I was interested in the way in which families and communities lived with the knowledge that there was someone locked in to the apartment, on the second floor, for example. The next chapter is called Mother of Sorrows. I'm skipping around a lot because I really want to have a conversation more than read my own work. And it's about an anexo started by a woman named Miriam, who started this anexo after the disappearance and murder of her daughter. And the place where she lives, Ecatepec, which is a sprawling municipality outside of Mexico City, has the highest rate of femicide in all of Mexico. Much of Ecatepec is an unruly mix of poor and working class neighborhoods. When seen from above, it appears to be a great sea of one-room cinder block houses, some of them painted in bright pastel colors and roofed with sheets of corrugated metal. Many of the houses appear unfinished and abandoned. Every morning, microbuses carrying tens of thousands of women from Ecatepec to Mexico City, where they care for babies, clean houses and hotels, and staff restaurants. Thousands more travel by the metro line that connects Ecatepec to Mexico City, or on the public cable car. The Mexicable was inaugurated with much fanfare in 2016, the same year that Mexico had the second highest murder rate in the world, second only to Syria. The elevated cable car glides over gigantic photographic portraits of disappeared and murdered girls and women, whose haunting images are plastered on the sides of homes and apartment buildings. There is one portrait of an adolescent girl with sad eyes and a furrowed brow, another of a woman looking down and to one side, gently smiling. The River of Remedies cuts through Ecatepec and reaches into Mexico City. Much of the shallow canal is cased in concrete and dotted with putrid islands of garbage and sewage. In the past decade, the river has become a liquid grave for disappeared women. One of these femicides led to the establishment of Casa Dolorosa, an anexo where women sometimes disappear themselves and their daughters to live. Miriam founded the anexo in 2015, nearly 2 years after her daughter Yenny's body was discovered on the bank of the River of Remedies. Yenny had been missing for 3 weeks, and during that time, Miriam had convinced herself that she was still alive. After Yenny was found, Miriam went silent. Her son worried that she had had a brain aneurysm, but it was grief that took her voice away. In many ways, Casa Dolorosa doesn't exist. It sits on a street without a street sign in an unnumbered building and doesn't announce its presence in any way. It's just a room on the second story of Miriam's concrete house. In addition, her husband Ulysses constructed for what they'd hope would be a growing family. When Yenny was alive, she and her son Ever lived with her parents on the first floor, while her brother, his wife, and their 2 children lived on the second, and the second floor would become the anexo. I went to Casa Dolorosa in the summer of 2016 with a research assistant. Miriam welcomed us to her home with a tight embrace, cups of instant coffee, and plates of scrambled eggs. Her husband was still asleep on their pull-out sofa, snoring loudly beside 5-year-old Ever. One of the first things that Miriam said to me was to call her by her first name. Here we are all madrinas, madrina suggesting the name of women who run Anexos, but Miriam did not want to be called anything that suggested that she was above anyone else. So we called her by her first name, Miriam. And in this little passage, I describe moving from the ground floor up to the second floor where the Anexo was located. About an hour into our visit, Miriam told the women who were gathered on the second floor, who were anexados, to gather for an announcement. I sat on the floor next to a woman who appeared to be in her early 20s. I'm Rosalia, she said. I'm Yenny's friend. I was struck by her use of the present tense and nodded in acknowledgement. Rosalia had been at the Anexo for nearly a week. It's not where I want to be, she said, but I'm safe here. I looked around the room at the community of women. One laid her head on the shoulder of another woman. Another took a restless toddler off her mother's lap, giving her mother a break. A few of the women held hands while others folded their arms tightly across their chest. One wore a pastel-colored household apron over her clothes. She stared at me with a weary expression. I wondered what scene she had fled before arriving at Casa de la Rosa. Miriam stood in the middle of the room and let out a heavy sigh. Yesterday, I had to turn away 3 women, she said. Today, there will be more. Madrinas, this is a safe space for you, but it's temporary. You have to make plans. Silence. Miriam continued, this is a safe space for you to rest, to gather strength, but you cannot stay here. She looked around the room and waited for a response. Slowly, a few women began sharing ideas of which relatives they might call upon or whether they could risk going to the police. The name of a shelter came up, but one of the women shook her head no, as if she had had a negative experience there, or perhaps it no longer existed. Miriam said it was time for a junta, a meeting. Immediately, I could sense that this meeting wouldn't be like the ones in the other Anexos I knew. There was no lectern that faced the rows of chairs, no counselors surveilling the room. The women didn't appear impassive or broken down. They seemed gentle and afraid. Miriam called upon a young woman named Edith to give testimony. I tried to concentrate on her story, but only certain words seemed to jump out at me: hitting, searching, crying, home. Around 3 in the afternoon, Miriam appeared with a small white cake. One of the girls at Casa de la Rosa was celebrating her 13th birthday. She wore jeans with pink flowers sewn on the back pockets. We gathered around her and sang Las Mañanitas in quiet unison. There were 2 candles. The birthday girl blew them out with one quick breath. The next chapter, which I'm skipping over, really talks about the sort of religious emphasis, particularly the Catholic sensibility of Anexos in Mexico. But I want to move here to a chapter called The Experience, which begins to describe the presence of Anexos in the United States, and particularly here in California and the Bay Area, where I've also conducted research. Donde hay mexicanos, hay anexos. It was early in my research when Serenity's Padrino Francisco, the person who ran this Anexo, explained that there are Anexos wherever there is a Mexican community. It was something others told me too. Anexos are everywhere. But Padrino Francisco wasn't referring to Anexos in Mexico City or elsewhere in Mexico for that matter. He meant that there were Anexos in the United States. We were in his office at Serenity talking about Javi, a 23-year-old anexado there. Quiet and shy, Javi avoided interaction with his peers and spent his free time sitting in a corner, sketching in a notebook. One evening, while I was helping him wash dishes, I noticed scars on the insides of his wrists. He caught me looking and dunked his hands into the grayish water, saying he'd finish the dishes on his own. The following day, I asked Padrino Francisco what brought Javi to the Anexo. He didn't have a drug problem, nor did he talk about violence at home or in his neighborhood, but he had been at Serenity for months. Padrino Francisco said that before Serenity, Javi had been in 3 Anexos in California, 1 in Riverside, 2 in Los Angeles. I was taken aback. There are Anexos in California? Padrino Francisco nodded. California, Texas, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Nevada, donde hay mexicanos hay Anexos. I asked why Javi ended up in them. Because he's crazy, he said. Shortly after my conversation with Padrino Francisco about Javi, a counselor called on him to give testimony, which is one of the main therapeutic activities in Anexos. Javi walked to the front of the room, stood behind the lectern, and fixed his eyes on the wall opposite him. The first thing he said was, "That's when I lived in California." In fits and starts, Javi began to speak about his time in an Anexo there. His uncle Raul had committed Javi after a series of psychotic breakdowns. The Anexo was a small house located in an industrial zone on the outskirts of Los Angeles. About half of the anexados left during the day in search of day labor, while the other half, los enfermos, the sick ones, remained locked inside. One night, all of the anexados were piled onto a bus with covered windows. They drove for hours. Finally, the bus stopped and the anexados were led into the dry heat of the Mojave Desert. Javi described what he called his experiencia, his experience, in loose fragments. There were men waiting in the desert with flashlights. In the distance, a fire. Men held hands and formed a circle around the flames. One tried to break free and run away, but was dragged back and beaten. Meanwhile, a group of musicians played calming music. Dawn was on the horizon. The anexados were not permitted to sleep. The next day, they practiced 4 and 5, 4 and 5, a reference to the 4th and 5th step of the 12 steps of AA, taking moral inventories and admitting wrongs. At night, they were forced to write by candlelight. After several hours, the anexados were given blankets and laid on the hard desert ground. Javi remembers looking up at the constellations that brightened the night sky. Coyotes howled in the distance. So one of the anexos that I began to study is in Oakland, California. And I just want to read a little bit about it. It's run by a remarkable woman, an undocumented immigrant, and it's really meant for women like her. Grupo Amor y Servicio is an anexo in Oakland, California. It's located in a 1-bedroom apartment on top of a garage that's set back from the street. There's no sign announcing its presence, and its entrance is in the back of the building, shielding it from view. At the time of my first visit, 7 women lived there. All were undocumented, and 4 voluntarily committed themselves to the anexo. Another woman was committed by her family due to addiction, and 2 were committed because of debilitating depression. The madrina who ran the place was also undocumented and had established the anexo with the needs of women like herself in mind. I go on to talk about her story, which is really her migration, story of migration, coming to this country, coming to Oakland, and eventually finding herself needing a place to live and starting this space for herself and for other women. And one of the key kind of therapeutic practices among people who are in Anexos, especially I think in the United States, is something called an experience, an experiencia. And this particular woman, Madrina Trini, would take her anexadas, the women in her anexo, on these excursions. And one time she told me, if you want to keep studying us, you need to do this too. So I went along with them. And in this little selection, I'm going to talk a little bit about that journey from Oakland to a place that I still don't know where we were taken. We departed on a Friday evening in August. Instead of a bus, we crammed into a white panel van with 2 rows of seating. Before we entered the vehicle, we were patted down and searched for drugs. Our cell phones, our watches, and overnight bags were taken away. Night fell quickly, and the headlights of oncoming cars lit up the faces of the group. Some people chatted while others stayed quiet with pensive looks on their faces. I sat next to a woman from Jalisco named Lupe. She was undocumented and cleaned office buildings in Palo Alto for a living. Her shift was from 7 to 12 at night when buildings were supposed to be empty. But people work late here in this country, and when Lupe knocked on office doors to empty waste packets, She was told to go away. She worried about being able to do her job. Lupe had 3 children at home, and rent for her 1-bedroom apartment was high. She developed nervios, kind of nervous condition. Time passed slowly, and the sound of traffic eventually died down. The road turned bumpy. We bounced around in the dark van, laughing nervously. The van finally stopped, and for several minutes we waited inside while a flurry of activity took place around us. Finally, the door slid open, and the smell of the forest perfumed the chilly air. I stepped out and looked up toward the dark tips of redwoods pointing at an indigo sky. And one of the main therapeutic sort of modalities in these experiencias is actually the practice of writing. And people are forced, this is all coercion, forced to write throughout the night. And so I'm just going to describe a little bit of the writing practice. Each initiate to these groups is called a writer, and they're always aided by 2 helpers and 1 listener. These are the roles that different people take in order to bring people to a state ultimately of catharsis. There were small folding tables scattered throughout the campsite, and each writer was led to one of them by their helpers. The tables were lit by kerosene lamps, but darkness pressed all around them, giving them a stage-like appearance. A stack of wide ruled paper was anchored by a rock, and 3 pens arranged in a neat row. My helpers sat next to me and my listener across. Their faces were shadowy, and the paper glared at me empty. We held hands and bowed our heads in prayer. One of the helpers asked God to give me patience and courage and to write in search of truth and forgiveness. The other helper removed a sheet from the stack and placed it in front of me. Her hands were small and shot through with blue veins. And then ultimately, I wrote through the night. We are all forced to write all night long. And then when morning would come on the horizon, we would be forced to do exercise and then take walks and all of these things until night would reappear again. And then we would begin another session of writing. And I'm going to read just a tiny bit from the second night when I wrote throughout the night. And this is a little bit of what I wrote. When night fell, the writers returned to their tables, new stacks of paper waiting for us. The empty paper stared at me, its blue lines blurred due to the darkness and lack of sleep. I held the hands of my helpers. They bowed their heads and asked God to give me strength to be vulnerable and hold nothing back. The first prompt that night was to write about my most distressing memory. I thought for a while and began to write. Kate and I grabbed a ride to Santa Fe. I brought a baguette and Kate a block of cheese that she stole from the health food store on Central Avenue. We had a picnic in the plaza and talked about the places we wanted to travel to, cities in Europe where we imagined living one day. We were 17 and in love. She encouraged me to make amends with my mother. Get over yourself was her favorite line. It was hot in Santa Fe and we took refuge in a bookstore. I walked away quickly when Kate slipped a travel book about France in her jeans. By that time, I had discovered confessional poetry and hid myself in the poetry section. So it's really meaningful that I'm in the poetry section here. We had an old record player. I was holding a book by Anne Sexton, staring at the black and white photo of her on the cover, thinking her beautiful. It was a paperback, but still too expensive for me to buy and too thick for Kate to steal. I heard my name, my father's voice. 2 years had passed since he left me. He stood a careful distance. I glanced at him when he held out his hand. He didn't want my hand. He wanted to see the book I was holding. He leafed through the pages, landing on a poem. Come, friend, I have an old story to tell you. I turned to look at my father. He was looking at the poem. I waited for him to look at me. He walked away, taking the book with him. I turned to the wall of books, dizzy. Then my father came back. He handed me a paper bag. Did we touch? We never touched. I didn't open the bag for days. I cried in Kate's arms. She finally opened it one morning. For Angela, love, Dad. And then finally, because I'm so anxious to get to conversation, I'm going to just read kind of the summary, a very abbreviated summary. You can see I've cut a lot of things out. And this is just really sort of my note to readers about where Mexico is today. Mexico is suffering a profound humanitarian crisis perpetuated by the United States with military aid and illegally trafficked guns. The war in Mexico reaches deep into the United States, where it is characterized by drug seizures, overdose statistics, and refugees fleeing unremitting violence. The spread of Anexos in the United States keeps pace with the worsening conditions in Mexico. Anexos dot a perilous landscape that spans both sides of the Rio Grande. And the shadow of the fantasy of Health City, which is I originally went to Mexico to study, are countless little rooms where people care for each other in ways that correspond to the reality of Mexico. Rooms like Serenity, Casa de la Rosa. These rooms couldn't be more different from the ideals of Health City. They're not sleek, spacious, or investment driven. Their practices of care do not correspond to the dictates of money or professional ethics, but to the experiential proximity of Mexico's most marginalized citizens. And while Health City remains a work of imagination, Anexos proliferate in neighborhoods of intensifying violence. The growing and changing population of Anexos makes visible the reality of Mexico's present. Rather than providing a way out, Anexos foreground this reality while challenging the way it is normally understood. They represent not just violence and despair, but also care and hope. And in doing so, Anexos do not deflect the ambiguities of life. Instead, they draw our attention to them, if only we open our eyes. That's it.
Oh, good, it's on. Well, speaking of annexes, I guess I am one to Angela. I'm so not the right person to do this. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not a good writer. I'm not into the poetry of words. I'm a humble geographer and social scientist, and my idea of research is a walk to the library. So I am kind of in awe of what she has done. But more important from your point of view is I'm in awe of the writing. I mean, this is a fucking brilliant book. And the way it captures the images, the people, fragments of history of Mexico, the links, the geographic links to the United States, around Mexico City, and much more. She has incredible depth of analytics. She introduces poets and philosophers when you aren't looking, and it's quite a tour de force. And on the first reading, it reads, you feel like you're moving through a series of fragments. It's not an easy read for two reasons. One is it feels fragmentary. I mean, you've got fragments here of this reading. And then you really have to go through it again, as I did. And suddenly it comes together like a sort of 1,000-piece puzzle. And you realize it's a magnificent picture and a very complete picture she's put together here from all these pieces. But it's also difficult in that the subject matter is not easy. As you can imagine, the subject matter of Anexos and the people in them and the conditions that drive people to be there, be put there, are appalling. And it's a lot of it's beyond, certainly beyond my experience and beyond the experience of, I think, most Americans. So I was asked to give Angela 3 questions, but because I just have to intrude myself as a former professor, I do want to say a few more things about essential elements of the book, if I can get this microphone to stop making funny little clicking noises. Okay, first of all, it's the originality of the study and the persistence and dedication to carry this off, to go do it. It's kind of phenomenal to embed yourself in these places for so long. I mean, over a 10-year period. I remember when I was a young professor and one elder professor told me, oh, yeah, that book takes about 10 years, a good book. And I thought, oh, no, I can't live that long. And now I realize that's what it takes. The richness of the portrait, the Anexos, each one, there are 6 different ones. The people within, it's very sympathetic, but with a very critical eye. So she both embedded and maintains her distance and understands ambiguities. The amount of background material about Mexico and Mexican history, about the links to the US, about essentially the greater background of time that has led Mexico to this place today is extremely thorough, extremely good. Same thing with the geography. And of course, as a geographer, I love that. She has this real sense of the geographic, of the way space is essential to everything we do, the way we live, the way we identify ourselves, to the connections, the links we make, whether it's in particular spaces of Mexico City, neighborhoods, individual buildings, as she mentioned before, but also these long distance connections across the border that are very rich too. So she really makes a lot of that, and it really comes together. It's not just that the linkages are there, but the differences matter too. The differences are profound. The revelations of her own personal and familial story, which she touched on a little bit there with the father in the book, and have the guts to reveal so as much as she does, and to weave it in to this story because it touched her. The Anexos touched her very profoundly, and obviously it spoke to something deep within her. And that is part of what makes this book so fascinating. The subtle and deep understanding of people and their psyches and how they're formed in families, and the often difficult relations of parents and children from both sides. And this runs all through the entire study of both her and the people she's looking at. But at the same time, unlike so much psychology, it's not just about the individual and the families, but the realization that individuals and families are formed within the larger context of the place, of the city, of their histories, of the country and its history, of even the United States affects the psyches of how these individuals are formed. And she manages to bring that in as well. The role of violence in all these areas, of course, is central, and its particular intensity in modern Mexico, and how much that penetrates into everyone's lives in these stories. These are working class people, or even beyond the kind of at the very bottom of society. A lot of desperate stories, and violence is everywhere. And I'm going to come back to that in my questions because it's so important. But it really penetrates in everybody's lives, their family relations, their psyches, and their hopes, their past, their hopes, their futures. The intersection of materiality, she didn't speak about this in that chapter, but it's all through here. The intersection of materiality and spirituality in people's lives. And although you can say it's about Catholics and saints and cathedrals and so on, this is true of all of us. We do it on our own ways, whether we formalize it in any religious sense or not. And even some of the kind of faith that people use for salvation, like the penitentes, who carry crosses and beat themselves and reproduce the stages of the cross every year in a big celebration. It's even worse in the Philippines, but it's something profound, and people use this to work through the horrors of their lives, and that touches on the story of the Anexos as well. And finally, the profound ambiguity of all of this, every level. She understands the internal contradictions of individuals, of families, of motherly love, of children, of relationship with their parents, of these counselors and leaders in the Anexos, what they're trying to do and not necessarily succeeding at, but sometimes succeeding. And as she said, I think in one interview she cites, or one lecture she was giving, somebody asked, well, do they cure people? She said, well, sometimes. So you can't see this as any kind of a simple portrait of Mexico, of Anexos, but of all those and all their incredible richness and difficulty. So now I'm going to ask you questions now that I've blathered on. You read them. So you deserve a little counterpoint there. Okay. So I got 3 questions. First is about the form of the writing itself. The second about the big picture, capital B, capital P, surrounding the Anexos. And the third is about your personal journey. So look out. I love the way you wrote the book with kind of what I've in the movie people call jump cuts. It just jumps around between places, times, Anexos, her story, Anexados, parents, and so forth. Now, I'm not generally a fan of postmodern writing. I've seen a lot of bad in my days as a professor, I saw a lot of very bad postmodern writing, but this is fucking brilliant. And she does it, it's brilliant in three senses. One is that it allows you to bring in an enormous amount of material that you couldn't do in a kind of chronological, typical academic book, which would be so much more boring. And this is not boring. Another is that it allows surprising juxtapositions, which remind me of my old pal, Mike Davis, and the way he could put juxtapositions. It just kind of made your hair stand up. And that's what Angela's been able to do. And the third way is that she weaves it all together so well. And yet, as she weaves all these pieces together, it has direction. There's direction to the whole story about the violence and redemption and self-discovery. It's kind of amazing. So here we go. How did you arrive at this scheme of writing? How carefully thought out was it? And did it emerge in a sort of fragmented stream of consciousness as the book evolved?
Well, thank you for your comments. Those were beautiful and very appreciated. In some ways, my mode of writing is actually really inspired by this bookstore, where I've spent so many years, so much time, decades actually. And I mean, I'm looking at this wall of books and I kind of want everyone to go away so I can just start like shopping. And I plan to, but writing has always been my mode of survival. Like I say in one little bit, I spent my period of being very marginally housed as a teenager, and the place where I lived was really a library. And so libraries, bookstores, these were the spaces where I was most comforted and found a space of imagination, basically, that took me to another place, basically, which is not an uncommon story. But I started off writing poetry. I still write poetry, never published any of it really, but I do like the fragment. I write about the fragment. I teach courses on the importance of fragment, the way that it can blend together all of these different narratives, but not in the way that is necessarily cohesive, but that leaves room for disturbance and lack of clarity. Like I like that. So I'm not really playing with it. It just kind of emerged. And I think that for me, in the process of writing, much like in the process of reading, you begin to have a journey of self-discovery. And it was really, I started off writing in some ways a kind of classical ethnography. That's what I needed for promotion at my job. And then I was like, fuck it. That's not what this story is about. This is also about my life, about why I cannot leave these places. And I just decided to go in whatever direction I went in. And I was so lucky to have an editor who pushed me to go even further, who just was like, keep going with this strategy you have, which really wasn't a strategy at all. It was just how I kind of began assembling things. So yeah, and I feel like for this particular project, the fragment, contradiction, ambiguity, all of this kind of feeds into the way in which I understand these spaces, which are incredibly contradictory, very ambiguous, and I wanted my writing to reflect that as well. I can't remember the next.
No, that's all right. However, well, it's true. The first time you read it through, you're sort of reading these fragments, these bits and pieces, going, wow, what's going to come next? But then when you look through it again, read through it again, and this is a book that deserves a second reading. it does cohere. That's what's amazing, is how well it does cohere. Okay, now, very different question. I'm going to go up to the sort of mega level here. I obviously like the scope of the book and how you brought together such a wealth of scenes, events, thinkers, and insights. You try to set the stage for the emergence of anexos, anexados at a certain time in Mexico, in this certain place, and everything that's gone into that at every level. Now, of course, that's impossible to do, even with your fragments, but because there's so many great fragments here, you do get a sense of what's going on in Mexico, what's going on in Mexico, and what's going on in the lives of these people. Okay, but the number one cause that stands out for the condition of the kids, the people that are in these places, why they've proliferated, and what is repeatedly emphasized, the word jumps out at you over and over as the book goes on, is the violence and las violencias. And violence doesn't just impinge on the life of Mexico's millions, but constitute it, as she says. So my question is, why does violence play the pivotal role here? And, I would have written a book about, if I knew what you knew about Mexico, I would have called it The Impact of Neoliberalism on Mexican Political Economy, because that's what it is. That's so much of it. That's very good. And, so much of the history of the last 40 years in the US and Mexico, and which brings the drug trade together in both places, goes back to Reagan, goes back to the changes in Mexico and the collapse of the Mexican model by the 1980s, the debt, and so on. So I know that's not the book you wanted to write or would have written, but why is violence the pivotal element here?
Well, I do try to talk about the shifting economics of Mexico, particularly after the fall of the PRI. But the reason why violence is so central is because that is what people were telling me. And so I listen. And I in particular, I listen to the voices of women, and I listen to the voices of kids. And my daughters might be like, no, you don't, but I do. And so it was really the voices of women saying, the reason I had to do this was because I was trying to keep my child safe, not necessarily because they were using drugs, but because we live in an environment where the drug trade is killing people. And so, Anexos are meant for people. They emerged in the late 70s, early 80s, and then proliferated in the 90s. So I try to track all of this through changes in, the Mexican economics, the fall of the peso, all of these different elements. But ultimately, what really mattered to me was women and saying, I didn't know what to do. Like, I want to keep my kid alive. This is the only resource that I have. I know that this resource is problematic and that they are likely being abused, but they are safer there than they are on the, unfortunately at home. And at the same time, I would be talking to kids in Anexos, and they would say, I don't even have a drug problem. I use drugs. Yeah, just like everyone else uses drugs, but I don't have a drug problem. But there is this gang that really wants to get me. And so they would begin to identify the reason why they were there as being related to the violence in their neighborhoods, the violence of criminal gangs, et cetera. And so it was impossible for me. I mean, I'm a medical anthropologist, so I prioritize like disease and addiction and all of these things. But it became very clear to me very early that this was not about addiction. This was not about that at all. This was about the violence that is increasing in insecure neighborhoods and the decisions that women must make in order to keep their children safe, which they know is a very tough ethical wager because they know their kids might be further harmed, but not to the extent that they would be if they hadn't been put away.
And you do capture it. Well, that's lovely, but we'll talk about that later. Let's move to the personal level, because your own story is such a big part of this book as a motivation for studying it and it's part of the warp and woof of the narrative. You feel a connection to the mothers, Hortensia in particular, and their plight, their love for their children, the ambiguity of their lives and choices. And you even end up dedicating the book to your own mother. You also feel a common bond with Anexos as someone who has felt lost in the world, dealt with harshly by your parents who themselves suffered, unable to face up clearly to your own inner demons. And you even join an Anexo in Oakland and submit to La Experiencia. So, since La Experiencia was done through writing rather than spoken confessions, which is what's done everywhere else, and the writing you did under duress for 3 nights was mostly about your personal history, was that the trigger for actually writing the book in this way? I'm beginning to think it wasn't, but I'm going to ask you this question anyway. Or did you have that idea before? And was the way that the Experiencia broke you down the key to seeing both your own story and the story of the Anexos clearly?
It's a really good question. I think that the Experiencia that I went on, which my daughters didn't even know I went on it, so I'm gonna I have a lot of explaining to do, because you would have not wanted me to go. But you know, one of the things that I just want to say about that journey that was so remarkable is I was writing. I was able to write it. I had 2 people beside me, 1 person across from me. A lot of the people that were also there, the other writers, could not write. So they would speak their stories to someone who would transcribe them for them. And so it was just such a profound moment of just like recognizing the ways story emerge, that they don't just happen through the individual writer, but they require a helper. They require a listener, which is exactly what these figures are called that are part of this movement. And I felt like I started writing the book after the Experiencia. I think that opened up a space for me to begin writing in a way that was less concerned with professional dictates and whether I was going to be promoted or get a raise or get, whatever. I just didn't care anymore. And that was partly because of that, just being in the forest with these incredible people who were trying to tell their stories in whatever way they could and to be supported to tell their story. And so I felt like this book for me was my opportunity. I really felt lifted by all of these people. I felt lifted by the Anexados who shared their stories, and by the people that were in the forest with me, by the Padrinos. I mean, everybody, they were very encouraging along the way. They thought I was a little crazy to be wanting to do this, but they stuck by me and they still do. And I was so pleased today. I was on KQED Forum. I don't know if you heard, but someone called and I was getting a lot of pushback from listeners saying these places are, not good. And then a person called, a Mexican man called and said, you know what? I was in one of these places and I needed it. And so it was like having my voice be out there so that other people can recognize something. Another person who emailed me last night who said, people always have said you were in a hellhole or you were in prison, you were not in treatment. And he said, you know what? I was in treatment and you were the only person that recognizes that was actually the complexity of this treatment. And I wanted my writing to help carry that complexity, and that the ability to do that was really kind of released through my own experience of being in the forest with others.
We're at 8:00. Peter? Oh, yeah. So I think we should go to that. Thank you. By the way, Peter, thank you for allowing us to do this, and really appreciate City Lights and you very much. Angela, from here on, you fend for yourself.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Take that mic, and if you can use the other one, so people online can hear. Okay, oops, sorry, Richard. Okay, so first question is from, let's see. Topher says, congratulations on the book. Is there an official number count of how many Anexos exist in Mexico, in the US? Is there is there psychiatric drug management in the Anexos you studied? Also, how do families and neighbors live with the knowledge that there's a room where there are people locked away? In other words, how do they reconcile and or challenge their existence?
No one knows exactly how many Anexos there are in Mexico, but public health experts that I talked to, and I talked to many of them, suggest that there are about at least 4,000 in Mexico City alone. And what's important to know in light of that is there are only 65 regulated residential treatment centers for drug addiction. So if you have 4,000 Anexos and 65 regulated treatment centers, which really speaks to the incredible disparities that exist. In the US, when I had a team of researchers, mostly grad students working with me on the project here, and we located within a month 23 Anexos in the Bay Area, not including San Jose. So they're in Redwood City, they're in San Francisco, they're in, they're Oakland, certainly. As the padrino told me in Mexico City, donde hay Mexicanos hay Anexos. Wherever there's a Mexican community, there are Anexos, and we have found that to be true. Parents, the thing I wanted to emphasize too is that a lot of these Anexos in Mexico City in particular are again located within sort of family apartment buildings. They're, an apartment within a multifamily apartment complex. So everyone knows what's going on. And I thought that there would be more concern, that people would be uncomfortable by this. People actually felt relieved and comforted to know that there was a place where they could put their kids or their spouse or someone they loved if they needed to be held, whether that was to detox from alcohol or to teach you a lesson, which was often the case, as women wanting to teach their husbands or their children a lesson for being bad or whatever. But also women use the Anexos in order to relieve themselves of the burden of having to take care of people at home. So sometimes women would put their spouse or their children in an Anexo in order to experience something like a little bit of relief, even though they had to pay for it financially. So they would have to work more hours in order to experience that quiet that they hadn't experienced for years because their households had been just in such disarray. So, they are these really complex spaces, and they exist in the open, even though they're clandestine. They're there, and everyone knows that they're there. The thing that pushed me really toward trying to understand them even further was the way they are depicted in the media as being hellholes of, keeping slaves of, if you look them up, that is, I guarantee that's what you will find. And my experience actually studying these showed me that they were not that. They are indeed very troubling, but they're not that. And they're born from the communities in which they are situated. They are composed of the people that need them. And in that sense, I think they're really deserving of our attention, and not just our, casting them away as being unethical or abusive.
Thank you so much. It's just a beautiful reading, and thank you for your great questions too. I'm just really interested in suffering, because the first example that you give of Hortensia's son being kicked and so abused, and then Dick's references to the penitentes and the self-flagellation that you associate with certain sects or extremes of the Catholic Church, and whether suffering is a necessity, like you would have a devil inside you, and the exorcism would require personal suffering. I think it's something very foreign to this culture. I think, we go out of our way to avoid suffering at any cost, really, to our detriment. So if you could just say a few words about that.
Yes, suffering is essential in a way. I mean, people are already suffering, but what the Anexo does is it brings people's awareness to their suffering. A lot of people I interviewed would say, really, it wasn't until I came here that I recognized that I was in pain, partly because they were reflected by others who have experienced similar types of violence or pain, losses, etc. But in terms of like, some of the practices that I wasn't able to discuss, one of the practices that was always the most, in some ways meaningful, but also really difficult to observe, was seeing all of the anexados. And, an anexo is about the size of this room. And there are more people living in them than are in this room currently. And they live there anywhere from 3 months to 10 years. It really depends on how long you have a family member paying for them to remain inside. And one of the rituals that I observed was people kneeling on their legs, holding their arms out straight in the sign, in like the sign of a cross kind of thing. And they would have to hold themselves in that position for hours. And if they began to fall, they would be usually, smacked on the side of the head, which of course is really hard to watch. But then they would like bring their arms back up. They would remain in that pose. They called it yoga, was actually the term. We're going to do yoga, but that was the position. And I always felt like there was something very meaningful that was the position that how yoga was expressed. But suffering is important. And one of the reasons why people are abducted is in order, the padrinos would tell me, we want them to know that they are at risk of dying. We want them to know that they are at risk of being disappeared. So we are going to enact that. And then they will be released into this space and know that they are alive and that they have people there who are similarly situated and that will care for them and be there for them. But it was important for them to go through that experience of, oh my God, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. I'm going to die. When you're bound, hooded, driving around Mexico City, you don't know where you're going. And then suddenly you're thrown into this space. And I describe this ritual or practice a few times in the book. And at first I was horrified. And then I slowly began to understand, not only from the perspective of the padrinos, but from the perspective of someone who actually had experienced this, whose cousin had been brutally murdered, decapitated. She said, I thought I was going to end up like my cousin, but in fact, I ended up here. And being here in this particular Anexo where she was for a long time gave her an opportunity to actually mourn her, her cousin and her family that she had lost and things. So suffering is like saturates this whole world. And it's also been something that I've always just been drawn to, thinking about suffering. What is suffering? What does it enable? How does it do more work than just bad? How does it actually make us human? And these spaces, I think, are places where you can really begin to get a sense of how essential suffering is to humanity, basically.
Oh yeah, thank you. I'll try to be quick, but I probably won't be. Thank you so much for your brilliant work. I'm so excited to read it. And your remarks, it felt like a review for the book. It was incredible. Yeah. Right. I have a couple of questions. The first one is around, you mentioned that some of the individuals are removed from their community because of violence. And so in my mind, I'm thinking you're removed, you're in this space for X amount of months or years, but most likely not. You're going to return back to the original space or home that you're in. And so what is that transition like? That's the first question. The second one is, as I think of people who have a substance use disorder and are detoxing, and possibly in a room with people who are there for all types of reasons, right? The physical detox is probably one of the most painful things a human can ever experience. Are folks mixed in with like the folks that are detoxing, the violence, like all of that? I'm just trying to get a sense of who's in the room. And then finally, there are parts of the book that you read around these spaces that incorporate like the 12-step elements, like the AA, possibly NA, I don't know. And so I'm curious around how do they choose what elements of these programs are incorporated in the setting versus what are not?
Those are really good questions. You know, people, much like addicts in this country, people cycle in and out of Anexos. So I've met people who have been in 20 Anexos in 10 years. You know, it means annex literally, but it refers to these particular spaces. In any case, it's a place. Yeah, it's a place. It's a room, like sort of like this room. So people are cycling in and out. Some of them go home, they end up coming back, but a lot of them actually make a life for themselves in these places. They graduate to become counselors. They may become the servers that do the kidnappings, but then they become the counselors, and then they become the padrinos. So there's a way in which they can make a life and a living for themselves. And a lot of people are very distrustful of that because they're able to make a living and they assume that it's a Ponzi scheme or something. But I've never met any padrino that, or madrina for that matter, who displays any sign of wealth. You know, I mean, these are working class, these are the working poor. And this is the way they not only make a living, but they participate in a much longer tradition of mutual aid in Mexico. So I see this as kind of emerging from a mutual aid kind of philosophy and tradition. But people are going in and out, they're coming in and out. I described this one girl who returns to a next. So everyone's like, hey, Ceci's back, or hey, Sheila's back, you know. And so there's friendships that are there, but they're very, you know, tense friendships in many ways. People are detoxing alongside people who are schizophrenic. They're detoxing alongside people that have been there for 5 years and are just completely exhausted. I used to work in a detox clinic, so I know what that pain is like. My first book is about working in a detox clinic. And so I think my having worked in that space enabled me to face the difficulties that I encountered in this particular environment. So detox, I mean, unfortunately, one of the ways that people detox is they're tied to a wall, they're chained to a wall. And one of the things that I did when I was working at this one Anexo is I said, you really don't need to do that. You know, this person is in a lot of pain. Oh, we're worried they're going to be flailing themselves around and cause problems. You know, they really don't have a lot of energy. So just let them rest, you know. So I was able to kind of create like these small little adjustments, but in general, I just tried to take it all in. For the third part, oh, that's great. Yes, there is a tradition in Mexico and here called grupos de cuarto quinto paso, fourth and fifth step groups, where they've taken the 12 steps and turned them into 2 steps, the 4th step and the 5th step. And the experiencia that I went on is all based on the 4th and 5th step of the 12th step. So most of the Anexos I worked in considered them 4th and 5th step groups. So not 12 steps, but 2 steps, and the 2 hardest steps. So again, this kind of emphasis on like difficulty and confession and seeking amends. And that's really where it's at in these groups. But these places actually did emerge from a kind of culturally adapted 12-step model that over the years just became more and more confrontational, more and more coercive. And in some ways fitting for the times is one of the things that I'm trying to say is like, they reflect the moment, you know, their practices reflect what's going on in the world.
We'd like to leave some time for a signing, and we're actually coming up on the hour. I know there's a lot of questions in here, but Dick, would you like to maybe wrap up with any final thoughts?
I think Angela should. No, okay. Look, it's a wonderful book. It's an intense experience, as you can imagine, given the topic, and well worth plunging into, grappling with, as Angela grappled with her subject and all its complexity and the weave of the whole story. And I think you'll see at the end that it's a beautiful tapestry that's been portrayed here, which of course is difficult because life is often very difficult, but it is beautifully done. And to a reader, to someone, a learner, this is exactly the kind of book you want to spend your time on. So thank you, Angela, for your wonderful work and for this wonderful book.